So in this lecture, we're going to be discussing bias in confounding. These are some of the issues which are very critical in epidemiological studies. So I'll briefly discuss, some background in terms of what is the aim of epidemiological. I'll give an introduction in terms of this concept of bias, interaction, and confounding. I will define these and give examples on some of these issues, some of these terms, so that you can understand them. Generally, in terms of our goal when you are conducting epidemiology, most of our research question in epidemiology, usually analytic epidemiology, the aim usually is to assess the relationship between exposure and outcome, and we'll be assessing this, in a study population. So our goal is to really find the relationship between our exposure and outcome. But as we study this, we don't study these things in isolation, and we study these things, in a population where there are various other things which might influence this relationship. So, as I said, we want to find the relationship between exposure and outcome, or risk factor and disease. And as we do that, we want to make sure whatever value we get is the true association between a particular exposure and outcome. So we want to get this true association, this true picture of whatever is happening, and it then depends with what measure of association we are measuring. If you are assessing relative risk, we want to get the correct relative risk. If it's for cohort studies, for case control studies, we want to get the correct odds ratio. And using the concept of inference, usually we want to estimate the confidence interval. The confidence interval, that's the range within which the truth lies, and this is the true, whatever you're estimating, that parameter, the range where it lies within that will be your confidence interval. So what you want in this whole epidemiology is to make sure you get the truth. And usually most of in terms of our results, you don't get a single result, but you get a result with an associated confidence interval, which then indicates where the truth actually lies. So as you do that, the whole aim is to provide a precise and valid answer to the research question at hand. So that's the whole purpose. So as you do that, in terms of to provide to get a precise and valid answer to whatever you are researching, either you're counting or either you're comparing. But as you do that, three things can go wrong. So the first thing which can go wrong, you might not be counting enough, and you might be whatever you count, you might not really count enough, or you might be counting, but you can be counting incorrectly, or in case you are comparing, you might make the wrong comparison. So because of all those issues, it is very critical, as we conduct epidemiological studies, to really be sure with whatever result which you are getting, is it the true result? And one of the issues which is important is the issue of what we call internal validity. So internal validity just refers to, does the study measure what it sets out to measure? The internal validity. Whatever you are assessing, depending on your research question, is it the true thing which you are assessing? Then there are two aspects. There's the internal validity and the external validity. Remember, when you are doing studies, we often use samples when you are doing studies. Then we use the results we get from sampling, from a sample, to infer those results to a population. So when you then infer, to the population, that's external validity, and whatever you found, does it really represent what is happening within the population? Whilst internal validity now, it really, implies to the sample, to the whole processes which which are done um, during the research. So those things are very critical. Then there are two, because of this, because of this statement, which, the truth is out there. Whatever you're measuring, is it true? Then we have got actually two concepts, two words, and two words which we use actually, which are very key uh, in terms of assessing validity, or whether whatever you're assessing is true. We have the issue of precision and the issue of of validity. So I will use these circles to try to illustrate these two principles of precision and validity. So let's take for example, in this case, what is our so our what we want, taking from this, what we want, our true results. I hope you know this thing which is used as a for darts, where where you're really aiming is the center, and it means that that's the that's the that's where you really, that's where you want, that's the result which is valid at the center. But as you throw your darts, some of them might hit the inner circle, others might hit the outer circle, or others might actually go out of this circle. So if you hit the center, it means that's what you really want. That's your aim, which means that's the validity and what your study really wants to measure. But there's also the component of precision now. So the component of precision, it then means, as you try to hit whatever you're hitting, how close are you to the center? And I think there was this issue you mentioned, the issue of confidence interval, and which cannot really, you know, you know, and whatever parameter you're measuring, and within the population, with how wide is the area, or it's like the gap where you expect this whole parameter you're measuring to be at. So yeah, using the same principles now. So if you take for this square number one, what you want anything closer, and closer to the center. So for this one, it's not precise, because your things are hitting far away, far away, far away, far away. But there is high validity. Why? Because at least you are hitting the center, so which really shows their validity. This one, it has both low validity and low precision. Then this one, we have got high precision. All your things, they are very close to each other, but they are far away from what you're measuring, which really means low validity, and but they are precise, but not valid. The same with this one now. This is what we expect, and in this case, it's more precise. All of your dots or your dots are hitting at the center, and they're also valid. They lie within within the circle, which you'll be really aiming. So the same principle really applies when you are really conducting our studies. Remember, we conduct studies using a sample. What we get from a sample, we then use it to infer what is happening within the population. What you measure, is it precise? Usually then determines by your confidence interval, and then you use that. So within the study setting, then that's the internal validity of your study. But the external, we are then referring to, as you infer your findings within to the population. So in most cases, not in most cases, but at times, whatever results which you are studying, or whatever you're studying, it might not be valid, and it might lack internal validity. And what is this internal validity? So it just means, your results. Remember, we discussed validity. There are two, and it's validity, internal and external. We discussed this. We discussed this. we discussed this this validity to say what the internal one. That's the study setting, and that's the is the study measuring what it intends to measure. So what the result you should then get, you can then use it to infer to your population. So there are several reasons, and which might really cause to have a bogus result or to have a fake result. What are some of these results? The first one is chance. Remember, you can just something might happen, just by chance. And I think the issue of chance. If you throw your dice, and let's say you're doing you're throwing a dice, or you're doing the hate method where you want to pick things. Everything in that, and there's an equal chance of being picked. So the same, you can get a result which is correct, or which is correct, or which is incorrect, just by the fact by chance. Or you can get a result which is also incorrect or bogus result due to bias, or you can get a result which is not correct due to what we call confounding. So we're going to be discussing these three aspects, which actually can cause or can lead to having a study which is biased. So I'll start with chance. So the issue of chance, I hope you have learned about p-values, or you have heard about p-values in your statistical lessons. So what is a p-value? A p-value tells us what is the probability that the result which we have may have occurred by what? By chance. So if you remember, most of the studies, when you're talking of p-value, we tend to use a p-value of 0.0 or 5%, 5% is the cutoff, and this is to really, when we have something which is less than that percent, you then say no, this one is not by chance, but we got it. It's statistically significant. So the p-value usually, that's one of the parameters which we then use to assess if whatever we have was it due to chance. So remember, p-value is not an indicator of validity. I hope there's a debate around the use of p-value, around the use of p-values, around the use of p-values. Actually, because a p-value alone might not mean anything, but for a p-value to then really mean something, it then has to be interpreted with other issues in consideration. So by just mere look of the p-value, it doesn't really tell you that whatever you're studying or whatever result which you got is a correct result. So I think you'll discuss a bit of these p-values when you are discussing your statistics in terms of the meaning of a p-value, null hypothesis, alternative hypothesis, in terms of understanding results. So before you really think that a result might have occurred because of chance, it is very critical to really first look into the issues of bias and confounding. So we'll not really discuss much about p-values and chance, but we'll discuss a bit on bias and confounding. So we start with bias. What is bias? Bias is the distortion of results due to a systematic error. And that's what we call bias. Your results, whatever you're studying or whatever you're doing, you will have incorrect result. Why? Because of a systematic error. When can bias arise? Usually bias arise during the study and during the design of the study and execution of the study. So the way you design your study, your protocol, how you are going to do your results, and how you then really execute your study, especially the data collection or even data analysis, can actually really lead to you giving wrong results or results which are biased. So bias cannot be quantified. Remember, we've got two types of errors when you're doing our studies. We have what we call the random error, and we have what we call the systematic error. Usually, systematic error is really occurs as part of study design, and it's when you're conducting your study. But random error it has to do with your sample size, and it has to do with your sample size. Let's say you want to know you're estimating, you want to estimate something. Usually the higher your sample size, which is close to population, the more likely you are going to get a better result. And usually random error now can be quantified or measured by using your p-values and using a confidence interval really to really estimate the size of this random error. So but bias is a systematic error. It cannot be quantified or it cannot be really measured. If you are wrong, if the way you're doing your study, you're collecting your data, you're analyzing your data, or whatever, the way you planned is wrong. So it's more of like it's systematic. So if you compare these two types of error, your systematic error and your random random error. So you realize that, as I mentioned, with your random error is due to your sample size. As you increase your sample size, your amount of random error and it will decrease. But even if you've got a very big sample size, but you're collecting your data really incorrectly, whatever you did is wrong, you maintain that error. It will not change no matter the size of your population. So I think that's one of the main points which you need to understand, the difference between random error and systematic error. Random error, it can be reduced by the sample size, but systematic error, you cannot reduce it. If you're making a mistake in the way you're conducting your study, you're making a mistake. So you cannot really change that. So remember, bias cannot be removed by adding more observations to your study. If you are doing it wrong, you are doing it wrong. So there's no way which you are going to change it. So your systematic error, that's the bias. So this slide just really, there are a lot of biases. There are a lot. There are so many, biases in terms of I think you can see all these words here. They're really trying to describe some of the things, some of the words where bias is used. So you've got allocation, intervention bias, apprehension bias, ascertainment bias, detection bias, diagnostic, whatever. So there are a lot of these biases, depending on whatever you're studying. But for us, we will not really look into all of these biases. We'll just look into a few of these biases. But make sure you find time and you read through these biases just to understand what is the meaning of some of these biases. So it's a very wide topic where there are a lot of issues which looks into bias. So as I said, what is bias is any process at any stage of inference which tends to produce results or conclusions that differ systematically from the truth. So you're making more or less the same error, which then produces a result, which then produces an error on the results, which is systematic. So a systematic error in the design, conduct, or analysis of a study that results in a mistaken estimates of an exposure's effect on a disease. Remember, as I said, this systematic error of bias, it can happen at any stage. It can happen at design, it can happen as you execute your design study, or it can also happen when you're analyzing your results. So this is very important for you to really to understand. What are the types of bias? So, as I mentioned from that slide, there are several types of bias. This is number one, which I will discuss. We'll discuss what is called selection bias. So, what is selection bias? Remember, I said bias can occur at any stage. So, in this selection bias, These are errors which will occur in the selection of your study participants. Then you've got what we call information bias. Information bias, these are errors in procedures for gathering relevant what information. Selection, that's the design. How you select your study participants. You might make an error. As you make an error in selecting your study participants, then that's sort of a bias in selecting your study participants. You might, we give examples to really show how some of this. Then information bias now. You have your study participants already, but the way you're then collecting your information, you can then really make errors, as you gather your information. What are these selection bias? So we discuss selection bias. What is selection bias? So systematic error in selected subjects into one or more of the study groups. If you remember our analytic epidemiology, how do we classify our studies? We can classify our studies and we have our case controls where you need to select cases or you need to select controls. Or we can have a cohort study where we are selecting those exposed and those who are not exposed. So we can really make an error, and it is used, I think we discussed in case control studies, but how do you select your controls? Because your controls should be more or less the same as cases, except the thing which you're studying, and which is very critical. Then for your exposures, it might also, have challenges in terms of really how are you selecting your exposures, where you can really make a mistake. What are some of the how can selection really how can selection bias? Okay, one of them is non-response. For example, let's say you're doing your case control studies. You identify your case, and you identify maybe you're using a line list from the hospital. So you get your cases. You then go to the premises or the houses of those cases. Then when you reach the house of these cases, some of the cases might refuse. That's non-response. So those who refuse to participate in the study, they might have something peculiar actually, which might actually influence your results. So non-response is another example which can really cause you selection bias. So I think we discussed these issues of external validity and internal validity. These are examples of selection bias. For example, this is in a case control study. What is the study question? Does excess coffee drinking cause pancreatic cancer? So we are studying it. We have a question like this, and how do you select your cases? So your cases, you select patients hospitalized with a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. Then what are your controls? Patients hospitalized at the same time for other reasons by the same doctor who hospitalized what the cases. So you see, because remember, it's the same doctor who is selecting people without cancer, and it's the same doctor who also admitted the cases. So because of that, you can have a strong relationship between coffee drinking and pancreatic cancer. Why? Because controls are more likely to be persons who are not drinking coffee due to GI problems or the doctor's advice. Remember, these are the patients from the same doctor, and this same doctor maybe is studying the association between pancreatic cancer and drinking coffee. So usually, because it's the same doctor who is treating these patients, he might really be advising some of the patients not to take coffee because of the risk of so because of that, you end up having strong association. You then find a strong association. Why? Because of influence of the doctor who is really treating the same patients. So he might be giving advice to the other patients, which then lead to. So it's an example of a selection bias, which can happen in a case control study. Then another type of bias from selection bias is information bias. And remember, I said information bias. These are errors which occurs in obtaining information when you are then collecting your data from your study participants. How can you have information bias? You can have errors. Remember, across the whole, that's information. You now have your information, which means you can have your errors. One, in the way you collect the information, and first, the way you measure the information, whatever tool you're using to measure, whether it's a questionnaire, whether it's a gadget, or whatever you're using, that tool can give you errors, which can lead to errors of measurement. You can also, maybe if you are recording, and you can also have errors when you are recording, how you manage your data and how you analyze your data. So remember, after collecting your data, there are several steps which then happens, up to analysis. So if you make an error at that stage, you might end up getting, getting things which are wrong. And we then call that information bias. So what are the sources of information bias? Remember, it can be subject variation, wherever you're studying. And if you're studying the people, usually people are not the same here. And the people, they differ. Yes, you might be studying children, but all children are not the same. You might be studying men, but all men are not are not the same. So because of that difference, you're also likely to get different information, especially if you are using deficient tools or you are using whatever you're using is not standardized. So then it becomes important to make sure that whatever you're using, we are using tools which are standard. And the observers, or the people who are collecting the data now, those are the observers. They need to make sure they are doing whatever they are doing properly. Because if they don't do it properly now, what will happen? These other researcher, data collector who collect information the way they will be collecting, someone will also collect information the way they will be collecting. So it then becomes important, and this is to really make sure you can also have technical errors in the process. So it then becomes important now. Usually, that's why you realize when people are conducting research, they have stages where actually they train the data collectors. In terms of how to collect data, they develop tools. Those tools are pre-tested, are pre-tested before they are actually used for data collection. I hope you've heard these words where people talk of pre-testing a tool or pilot. Pilots, you're not like you're looking in the whole study to see whatever you want to do would really make a difference. Whilst when you're talking of pre-testing, and pre-test is about data collection too, where you're really assessing your tools to make sure whatever they collect and it is validity now, issues of validity. Remember, for you to collect and whatever you want to get, you are going to use tools, and that's the intent of the validity of that tool, and we should be using. So it's very important, really, to make sure your things are standardized. People who are collecting the data and are trained, and they understand some of those issues. This is an example of how information bias can occur in a case control study. So is perinatal infection associated with fetal malformation? And this is examples of information bias. So newborns, what are your cases? Your cases will be newborns with congenital malformations. What are your controls? Health newborns. And your results, you get strong association between mothers of infection, of mothers with mothers. So your question, you want to see the association between perinatal infection and fetal malformations. So what do you get? You will get strong association between mothers' recall of infection during pregnancy and malformation. And this is what will have happened here. In this one, you have the type of information bias which you have. You have what we call recall bias. And this is what is this recall bias? A recall bias, usually parents of children with congenital malformations are more likely to report infection during pregnancy than parents of children without what congenital. So if you what can I say? If you're a victim of something, you tend to remember, vivid experience of what happened because you are a victim. But if you're not a victim of whatever happened, you are unlikely to remember. So that's the recall bias, and which actually really has caused this, to have this information, this information bias in a case control, where mothers who have child with malformation, the more it's very, it's painful, and it's really difficult to accept, for most mothers. So because of that, they tend to recall more, as opposed to mothers without that experience. Another example is this one is for cohorts. In cohort studies, is the use of oral contraceptive associated with an increased risk of DVT? So DVT is deep vein thrombosis, and it's a condition where you can have thrombi, in the veins. And this is like you start the question. So exposed, those are the women who are using oral contraceptive. Those unexposed, those are women who do not use oral contraceptive. In this case, what do you see? You see a strong relationship between oral contraceptive and DVT. What might have happened in this case? We have what you call, remember, information bias. There are several types of information. What of information bias? So I gave here, this one is a recall bias, an example of information bias. And it is an example of information bias. Then we had recall bias. Then this one now of DVT is what we call surveillance bias. By surveillance, I think we've discussed surveillance lecture. Surveillance is mainly about monitoring. So by surveillance bias, what happens? Women who use oral contraceptives are more likely to receive a diagnosis of DVT. Why? Because as a clinician, as a doctor, and if someone is taking oral contraceptives, they are likely to develop DVT. So because of that, you really put in strong surveillance system. So because of that, you're likely to diagnose those women of DVT. So because of that, you end up getting a stronger association. Why? Because of that, because of the surveillance. So just to really add, on top of the two examples which I gave in terms of bias, we may discuss the recall bias, surveillance bias. We also have what we call reporting bias. We also what we call bias from interviewing. We also have bias from surrogate interviews and bias in abstracting records. So those are examples of bias which you can discuss. But as I mentioned, there are lots more biases here, which then depends, what you're looking and what you're studying. What is recall bias? Just to recap from our example above, happens when one group is able to remember an event more clearly than the other. And I gave an example of, usually if you're a victim, you tend to, to have vivid experience of what happened, as opposed to someone who's not a victim. Then surveillance bias, and if a population is monitored over a period of time, disease ascertainment may be better in the monitored group than in the general population. So people who are monitored, those who are monitored because they're at risk, the chance of really getting a disease is higher as opposed to those who are not monitored. Then reporting bias. A subject may be reluctant to report an exposure he or she is and is aware because of the attitude, belief, or perceptions. There are some things which are sensitive, or there are some things which are shunned by the society. So because of that, some people might not really report them. Why? Because they then fear, the stigma attached to whatever they are reporting and all those issues. Things to do with abortion, maybe sexual orientation, some of the things are sensitive depending on setting. So at the end of the day, people might what we call selective, and they can select whatever they want to report, choose to report other things and not report the other things. Then you can also have bias from interviewing, or we have what we call the Hawthorne, the Hawthorne effect, where people, they tell you what you want to hear. So usually it happens when you ask leading questions. And so because of that, people end up telling you what you want to hear. So that Hawthorne effect usually is very common among healthcare workers, and where people they tend to phrase the way they phrase their questions, the way they phrase and they phrase their questions or whatever they're asking, they are really pushing towards to get a specific answer. So because of that, this is bias which is coming from the interviewer. So it's interviewer bias or bias from interviewing. It depends how you interpret it. Then we've got surrogate interview. We are not actually interviewing we are not really interviewing the correct person, but in this case, we are interviewing someone on behalf of someone, a surrogate. You are not actually really interviewing the actual person. So, for example, person giving information not as reliable. And remember, for example, widows, they tend to inflate the importance of their husband's jobs. Someone, people, they tend to speak good, when someone is is passed on. So because of that, you can actually have it incorrect. Or maybe another very common thing is when you ask mothers and it's about their children. So they tend to really speak good about their children and really not really say some of the things. Why? Because of, you can then end up having surrogate interview bias, because someone is not really giving the truth, but is trying to inflate or to overshadow some of the things. Then you can also have bias, in terms when you are abstracting records. Usually this is very common. So it can happen. The way maybe your tool is not standard. Whatever tool you are using to collect your data, or one of the common things which cause bias is missing information or missing data. Because as you abstract your data, some of the information might be missing. So it's also very common. What are some of the things which you can use to controlling bias? I think we have discussed some of those issues before. It actually depends with the type of bias which you're talking about. But I just give a list some of the example. Because you can do what you call blinding. That's one of the example. For example, how can you do the blinding? It prevents investigators and interviewers from knowing a case or a control, or knowing exposed or non-exposed. You just you just select your cases and your controls, but you don't tell whoever is collecting data, this one is a case or a control or exposed or non-exposed. Why? Usually, if you're asking a case, you tend to probe more. You tend to really probe more to really, to confirm some of your things, as opposed when you're asking a control or asking someone who is not exposed. So by blinding, it means actually you're kind of really preventing that. Then you can also do this in the way in which you do your survey. We have what we call the white quotation, white quotation, usually that's the fear, and the white quote usually refers to the doctors, and that fear when you're talking to a doctor or someone of authority. So because of that, actually, people might really say the incorrect things, or may panic, or really may avoid saying other things. Why? Because they are face to face with the interviewer. So because of that, you can actually do mail, where you can send your questions by mail, or you can send your things by phone, and as opposed to face to face. Then when you're collecting your data, how can you also control for bias so that you get correct information? You can use multiple questions that ask the same information, and they act as a built-in and in double check. So, for example, one of the most questions which you see people use, they can ask you your date of birth, then they ask you your age. So it's the same question, which is asking the same information. And if you use date of birth, you can get your age. So so that's more or less the thing, where you're using multiple questions that ask the same information. The other question, they are kind of double check to see, which you can then use to correct whatever information might have been corrected. So you just need to be careful in terms of having some of these questions, which you can use to double check. But I think it's something which is something which can be done. We also call that triangulation. And this thing, triangulation, I think, is more or less like what we are saying on the next point about accuracy, where we can do multiple checks in medical records, gathering diagnosed data from multiple sources or multiple sources, and that's the triangulation, where you're using data from various sources to really confirm on whatever you are and you'll be collecting. So yeah, I think that's really just some key points in terms of bias. But remember, as I mentioned, one of the things which you can have, is your selection, and is your remember, you can make a mistake. Is your selection bias, where you can make a mistake, and so in this case, you are making a mistake. You are putting incorrect groups in terms of cases, and for cases and controls, or exposed or non-exposed. As you are doing your selection and of your case, of your control, you might make a mistake where you put someone who is a case, then they are interviewed as a control, or someone who is exposed, they are interviewed as non-exposed, or vice versa. So that's we call that misclassification, actually, where you classify whoever you are studying, and either is a control, you then put them in a case, or someone is exposed and it is exposed, you then interview what is an exposed. So this misclassification, which happens in terms of exposure or outcome, and for case control studies, it can be classified into two. We can have what we call differential classification and non-differential classification. You can have what we call differential misclassification and non-differential misclassification. What is this thing, differential misclassification? For differential misclassification, this one, it occurs when the degree of misclassification MC of the exposure variable is influenced by outcome variable, or the degree of misclassification of outcome is influenced by the exposure. So it means the exposure or the outcome, and it is actually influencing the way you are placing your case, your control, or exposure or non-exposure. So these two, they are influencing each other. And so if you are doing this, and what is the, if remember, this misclassification or this error which happens, it then affects your final results. And so so this misclassification, and in terms of how does whatever you want to measure, and the thing which you are measuring, differential misclassification, where the exposure or the outcome is influenced by the other, they influence each other, so that you make what there's that mistake, and your results, whatever you want to get, what you want to estimate, and it bias that the results towards or away from the now. From the now, it means there's no difference. That is, you are not seeing any effect. So it can actually go anyway. It can go towards or away. So it's not like really to say if you make that error, it will push your results. But it can actually have your results towards point of no association or away, and in any direction. Then for your non-differentiation and non-differential misclassification, this one now, it occurs when the degree of misclassification of the exposure or outcome is not dependent on each other. That's non-differential. They don't depend on each other. I'm trying to think of an example. Maybe I'll look for for an example to really explain this. But your outcome or your exposure or your outcome is not influencing the way you are misplacing, or you're putting things in the wrong category. And differential, your outcome or exposure is influencing the error, but in non-differential, the exposure or outcome is not dependent on the other, so they are not really influencing each other. In this case now, how does this error affect your study result? your bias, and you bias your estimate towards the noun, which means no effect. Non-differential, what do you think? It can go either way. No effect or effect in either way. But if it's non-differential, you are actually going to see what no association or no effect or of whatever relationship, which will be which will be studying. So in terms of bias, what are the things what are the things which you need to do with bias? You need to evaluate and see why did it occur, and how does it really, what effect does it have on the observed association? Remember, we discussed it depends, and with whatever bias we have, with every bias which we have, at some point you need to kind of evaluate it, so that you really understand, and what is going on. Then you can also really to make sure you control it and prevent it so that it doesn't really happen. So remember, as I said, this bias can occur at any level of your study. It can occur from the start, and when you are designing your study, up to the end when you are collecting or analyzing what your data. You just actually go to the further step where you can have bias, actually when you are publishing your results, or when you can actually choose what to publish, and it's publication bias, or you can choose what you want to publish or not to publish. Usually people, they don't want to publish things which are negative. They tend to stick on things which are positive, and in most of the case. So really, it's really a good thing to really have this in mind as you prepare your study, to pick where you can have possible bias, and you correct it at an early stage. What are some of the things which can be done to prevent bias? Care for attention to your sampling, and this is how you choose the selection actually, and this is how you remember. I mentioned the bias is a systematic error. It cannot be removed or changed by what? By increasing the sample size. If you're making a mistake, you're making a mistake. If you start 1,000 people and you're doing your things wrongly, you always get your wrong things. Garbage in, garbage out. Then remember, we talk of selection bias, non-response as an example of selection bias. So you need to make sure you minimize what non-response. But one of the things which is also very critical, and in terms of non-response, it is always advisable to have characteristics of those who don't respond. You then compare the non-responders, that is, those who didn't respond, and those who responded. Maybe if you see a difference among those who responded and those who not responded, then maybe they can be really, biased, maybe, so it's usually critical when you are doing your study to have to collect information on none, and to have information about non-responders, their characteristics. Why? Because we can then use that information to compare, to compare with your responders. If there's any issue, you can just use maybe the demographic information, maybe the age, level of education, some of these things, which might be available depending on what is what, and on what is available. Then we discuss the issue of standardization of measures. Very important, and this is where you train your people who are measuring. We are using the same tool, and one of the things is training, where you train your data collectors, and it's in terms of having same way of doing things, and also issues to do with quality control, and you need to really put in systems to control as you collect your data. Then we discuss the issue of blinding, and this is where you remember the blinding. Blinding can be applied mostly in analytic studies, and it is where you can blind for case control studies and codes. Wherever we just select your case, ask people to collect information. You don't tell them, good, this one is a case, this one is a control, and they just collect their information without knowing. Then without knowing the exposure, or it's a case for blinding. If you're talking of RCTs, I think it's something else, and this is one thing which we have discussed when we discussed RCTs, where we talk of single blind, double blind, or triple G, or triple blind. So I think this brings us to the first part of our lecture, where we have been discussing bias. So we discussed the chance, then we discussed bias, and in the next lecture, we'll be discussing confounding and effect modification.